There's an urban legend that after the complete and utter failure of the massive misfire that was the E.T. Atari video game, millions of unsold game cartridges were shamefully buried in a landfill, never to be seen again. Is this true? Well, sorta. This story is part of a larger story, the video game crash of 1983, a large-scale recession that nearly sunk the video game industry forever. But how did this shocking event happen? What were the biggest causes? And how did it forever change the video game world? Well, let's get into that right now. Like a lot of huge historical crashes and major disastrous world events, the great video game crash of 1983 wasn't just caused by one thing. What's the saying? Rome didn't fall in a day? Close enough. Instead, there were a lot of small events that eventually snowballed and formed an avalanche of misfortune. One of the biggest was an absolutely oversaturated console market. Point the blame to the Atari 2600. When that console launched in 1977, it did all right, but took a few years to find its proper footing. But thanks to the absolute explosive popularity of Space Invaders in 1980, sales skyrocketed and soon people couldn't get enough of the console. Though, what's that other expression? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Because after that, companies started to realize how lucrative the video game console market was. And we got a whole smorgasbord of new consoles, both from Atari, like the Atari 5200, as well as from competitors like ColecoVision, which sounds like the sequel series to WandaVision, doesn't it? All this rapid growth created a whole lot of competition and oversaturation. But other factors helped cause it too. Before 1979, there were no third-party game developers. Companies like Atari produced and published their games in-house. But naturally, things changed. The formation of Activision in 1979, which was mostly formed by disgruntled Atari programmers, was a huge game changer, which opened the door to more and more third-party developers to penetrate the marketplace. It became a feeding frenzy by 1982. A popular game would come out, and then immediately all these other companies would produce similar games to try to capitalize. Both the additional consoles and glut of games were just too much. It's like if you tried to eat a triple cheeseburger and an ice cream sundae at the exact same time. There's just not enough room. Of course, another big factor was the loss of faith from consumers, because companies like Atari were trying to stay ahead of everything else and get products out fast. It caused some major hiccups. Two games released in 1982 served as huge nails in the coffin for Atari and directly contributed to the video game crash: Pac-Man and E.T. the Extra Terrestrial. Pac-Man was critically panned with horrible graphics and a lot of vendors canceled orders. Then E.T. was worse. Infamously developed in just 6 weeks to hit the Christmas season, E.T. was an absolute mess and despised. The story goes that Atari produced 4 million units, but allegedly 3.5 million units were returned to Atari unsold. Ouch. And let's not forget the competition from video game consoles' dreaded enemy, the personal computer. This was right around the time that personal computers got a major facelift and became a serious competitor to video game consoles. In a lot of instances, you could buy a personal computer which had better specs overall for about the same price as one of the consoles and still play games on it. This was the final nail in the coffin, and then the whole thing collapsed. How bad was the crash actually? Well, let's put it in monetary terms. The video game market earned about $3.2 billion in 1983. In 1985, it earned about $100 million. Sure, not a small chunk of change by any means, but that's a drop of almost 97%. That's insane. In the short term, a ton of publishers had to shut down and fold, mainly due to retailers demanding funds from publishers over unsold games and publishers being unable to provide them. Atari was hit hard and laid off about a third of its staff, while having to bury a lot of the excess stock in a landfill in New Mexico, hence the E.T. stories. Long-term, the crash fundamentally reshaped the gaming market and continued to have a rippling effect over the years. A lot of bigger companies that survived the initial onslaught of shutting down decided that video games were just a fad and moved away from making them to focus on other electronics, while a huge push was made to limit and control the development of third-party software for the future. After the crash, the market slowly and surely started to rebuild itself, but with a few drastic changes. For one, the US lost its foothold as the top market for home video game consoles, and Japan, who wasn't affected as badly as the US over the crash, managed to push its way to the top. While Atari was floundering, a Japanese company by the name of Nintendo, you may have heard of it, was able to release their first official worldwide video game console, The NES, or as it was known in Japan, the Family Computer, or Famicom for short, was released in July of 1983 and rose from the fiery wreckage that was the video game Crash. As we know, this console completely changed the game. It's not only one of the best-selling consoles of all time, but its design and its general business practices with third-party developers set the standard for everything going forward. And I wonder how much Atari kicked themselves over not working more closely with Nintendo. Originally, a deal was supposed to be signed between the two gaming companies right before the crash, where Atari would release the NES under Atari's name for the North American release, but the deal fell through due to some crazy corporate shenanigans, and now the rest is history. Nintendo did end up releasing it themselves in the US, and they continued their dominance of the video game world. It's crazy to think what would have happened if this devastating crash never happened. Would things look much different today? If Atari had a better handle on things overall, could it have saved itself and remained in the totally dominant position even still today? I guess we'll never know. Seriously, although the E.T. game landfill story has been exaggerated over the years, it's still out there somewhere. Quick, grab your shovels and let's find it. Who wouldn't want thousands of copies of E.T. the game in your living room, right?